If you care about how American power is exercised after war and who gets to decide the future of a devastated region, you need to pay very close attention to what I'm about to explain. Because what happened in the last 24 hours was not just another foreign policy headline, it was a move that stunned diplomats, confused allies, and sent quiet alarm signals through Washington's national security establishment. Late yesterday, Donald Trump announced the creation of what he called a Board of Peace, an international task force intended to oversee Gaza's post-conflict reconstruction and long-term governance. At first glance, the announcement sounded almost bureaucratic. A committee, a board, a framework, the kind of language that usually signals months of planning and cautious diplomacy. But this wasn't that. There was no prior briefing for Congress, no coordinated rollout with allies, no advance notice to the State Department's regional experts. Instead, the proposal appeared suddenly, fully formed, and immediately raised one unavoidable question. Who exactly gave Donald Trump the authority to decide what comes next for Gaza? According to the announcement, the Board of Peace would include representatives from multiple countries, international development figures, and security advisors tasked with rebuilding infrastructure, restoring civil administration, and preventing militant resurgence. In Trump's own words, the goal was stability, prosperity, and permanent peace. But behind that language lies a far more complicated reality. Because Gaza is not just rubble and humanitarian need, it is one of the most politically sensitive territories on Earth, claimed, contested, and emotionally charged across generations. Any attempt to reshape its governance inevitably steps into unresolved questions of sovereignty, legitimacy, and power. And this is where the shock truly set in. Multiple U.S. officials speaking on background admitted they learned about the Board of Peace at the same time the public did. Senior diplomats reportedly scrambled to understand whether this task force would operate alongside existing international mechanisms or replace them entirely. That distinction matters more than it seems. For decades, post-conflict reconstruction in Gaza has involved a fragile mix of UN agencies, regional governments, donor states, and local actors. Every attempt to impose a new structure has collapsed under political resistance, security breakdowns, or accusations of foreign control. Yet Trump's proposal appears to bypass many of those constraints deliberately. Supporters describe it as decisive leadership, a clean break from failed processes, a willingness to act where others hesitate. Critics see something entirely different, a unilateral power play dressed up as peace building. And then there's the timing. The announcement comes at a moment when ceasefire discussions remain unstable, humanitarian access is contested, and regional tensions are still dangerously high. In diplomatic circles, timing like this is rarely accidental. So why now? Why announce an international governing board before the dust has even settled? And why do some analysts believe this isn't really about Gaza at all, but about reshaping America's role on the global stage? Those questions lead directly into what wasn't said during the announcement and what insiders say is happening behind closed doors. To understand why Trump's Board of Peace immediately set off alarms, you have to understand what it is not. It is not a United Nations mission. It is not a formally authorized international coalition, and it is not grounded in any existing treaty, resolution, or multilateral framework. That distinction is crucial. Within hours of the announcement, officials connected to the United Nations privately confirmed that they had not been consulted. The same was true for senior figures at the U.S. Department of State, many of whom reportedly learned about the initiative from news alerts, not internal briefings. So what is this board? According to early descriptions, the Board of Peace would function as an advisory and coordinating body, composed of international representatives selected by the United States, tasked with overseeing reconstruction priorities, security coordination, and civil administration planning in Gaza once major hostilities subside. Notice the wording, selected by the United States. That alone marks a sharp departure from traditional post-conflict governance models, which typically rely on UN mandates or regional consensus to establish legitimacy. Trump's proposal flips that formula. Instead of legitimacy first, authority later, it asserts authority first and assumes legitimacy will follow. Supporters argue this is exactly what's been missing. They point to decades of stalled peace efforts, billions in aid that failed to stabilize the region, and international bodies paralyzed by vetoes and competing interests. From this perspective, the Board of Peace is framed as a pragmatic solution: less process, more control. But critics hear something very different. They hear echoes of past interventions where governance structures were imposed from the outside, only to collapse under local resistance. They hear a plan that risks appearing colonial in tone, regardless of intent. And they hear an approach that sidelines Palestinian political agency at a moment when legitimacy is already fractured. And there's a deeper legal issue that few headlines mentioned. Under international law, administering post-conflict territories is not simply a matter of good intentions. It raises questions of occupation, consent, and sovereignty. Who authorizes the board? Who enforces its decisions? And what happens if local actors reject its authority outright? These are not academic questions. They are the difference between reconstruction and prolonged instability. What makes Trump's move especially controversial is that it seems intentionally to avoid answering them, at least for now. Multiple foreign policy analysts described the rollout as strategically vague. No list of countries involved, no timeline, no advance notice of the funding mechanism, no explanation of how the board would interact with existing Palestinian institutions, if at all. That vagueness may be deliberate. By keeping details fluid, the proposal remains difficult to attack directly. Critics are forced to argue against a concept rather than a concrete plan. Supporters can project their own expectations onto it. But ambiguity also breeds mistrust, especially in a region where every word is scrutinized. Privately, diplomats warned that announcing a governing board without buy-in risks hardening opposition before negotiations even begin. Once actors feel excluded, they tend to organize against the process rather than engage with it. And that brings us to the most revealing detail of all. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, several U.S. allies immediately asked the same question after the announcement. Is this a peace initiative or a political signal? Because if it's the latter, then the Board of Peace may be less about rebuilding Gaza and more about redefining who gets to shape the post-war order. And that interpretation leads directly into the international backlash that followed, quietly at first, then very publicly. Within hours of the announcement, the public reaction focused on the obvious questions: feasibility, legality, and motive. But behind closed doors, something else was happening, something far more revealing. Phones were lighting up in foreign ministries across Europe and the Middle East, because while the Board of Peace was presented as an international task force, many of the countries assumed to be involved hadn't agreed to anything. Some hadn't even been asked. According to multiple diplomatic sources, officials from European Union member states expressed immediate concern about the optics. One senior European diplomat described the proposal as a structure without a mandate, warning that participation could be seen as endorsing unilateral U.S. control over Gaza's future. That hesitation mattered much. European funding has historically been one of the largest contributors to Gaza Reconstruction. Without it, any rebuilding effort faces enormous limitations, and early signals suggested that Europe was not prepared to simply sign on. In the Middle East, the response was even more cautious. Governments that have quietly worked with the U.S. on regional stability were reportedly unsettled by the lack of consultation. Several Arab states, already navigating intense domestic pressure over Gaza, worried association with a U.S.-led governing board could ignite backlash at home. One regional official put it bluntly: if this looks like outside administration, it's dead on delivery. Meanwhile, reactions from Israeli officials were mixed and telling. Some security figures privately welcomed the idea of a structured post-conflict plan, arguing that a vacuum in Gaza would invite chaos. Others worried an internationally administered board could limit Israel's operational freedom or create long-term oversight it doesn't control. That internal divide spilled quietly into public messaging. Carefully worded statements praised creative thinking while avoiding any explicit endorsement. Then came the silence from a group whose response was perhaps most important of all. Palestinian political leaders were not included in the announcement. No representatives were named, no role was clearly defined, and for many observers, that absence spoke louder than any press release. Analysts warned that excluding Palestinian voices at the outset risks delegitimizing the entire project. Even reconstruction efforts perceived as beneficial can collapse if they are viewed as imposed rather than negotiated. History offers painful lessons here. Past attempts to engineer post-conflict governance without local ownership have repeatedly failed, often worsening the instability they were meant to solve. The memory of those failures is fresh, especially in Gaza. So why push forward anyway? This is where timing becomes critical again. Several U.S. foreign policy veterans noted that the Board of Peace announcement coincided with growing frustration in Washington over stalled ceasefire progress and limited leverage on regional actors. In that context, the proposal begins to look less like a finished plan and more like a strategic pressure move. By putting a bold framework on the table, Trump effectively forced governments to react, publicly or privately, to a new reality.